Heather, it's so
Yeah,
good to see you, and I'm so glad to have you on an N of One. This is a story like I'm very excited to tell.
I'm
Uh,
so excited to be here. Thank you so much.
yeah, this is going to be super fun. As you know, the theme of the show, right? It's not so much about, the things you've studied or the projects you've done, but rather about you and telling the story of Heather. So often we look at as social psychologists and sort of behavioral scientists about groups, right? The every person, the every Heather, right? But we forget that there is a specific Heather whose story is meaningful and important and can inspire somebody. And so I want to tell your story today.
Great.
And so I want to go all the way back to beyond when I knew you. I mean, we don't have known each other a long time. I want to go like way back, like 7-year-old Heather. Like, what was 7-year-old Heather like? Like, what were you like as a kid? What did you want to do? Like, what were you like in school? Were you like outside of school? Like, bring me up to speed.
Yeah. So this will come as no surprise. 7-year-old Heather, gigantic nerd. So come by it honestly. I was thinking about this morning, anticipating our conversation. And I think some of this is sort of a little bit of um, nature meets nurture. My parents decided to have children crazy young, which is a great gift for me now as an adult. And also looking back, like, what were you people thinking? But what that means is I was born when my dad was still in grad school. And so like that meant that like pre-7-year-old, very, very tiny Heather was exposed to sort of this idea of academia and higher education and like building a career and doing research and those sorts of things. So like 7-year-old Heather was aware of those things and thinking about those things and thinking about grad school because I was, again, a nerd, a little bit of a weirdo. And also as, a good eldest daughter, like also very intense. And so that
So
was
some
kind of
things haven't changed then.
exactly. It's all a little bit hardwired sometimes. But yeah, so, and then there was also like the normal things that we did at that time when some of us were 7, roller skating, going to see our friends, being out until the sunset, all of those kinds of things. We moved around a lot when I was a kid. So I've lived in a lot of different places. I've had the experience of building friendships in multiple places. And often when I'm only going to be geographically in the same space as people for short periods of time. And so I think that has also been something that's sort of like shaped how I think about the world and how I think about community and how I think about what are the different ways that people build relationships, maintain those relationships over time, and how does that impact the way that we approach other things in our lives. So that's a
Nerdy.
little bit in a nutshell. Yeah.
Nerdy and intense.
Mm-hmm.
Some things are stay the same, and that's lovely and awesome. What was Dad studying?
So his background was initially in geology, and then he did his graduate degree in mining engineering. And so he's done a lot of work in places like that were called test site in the 1980s. Where do we store things after we have used things that are, ecologically responsible and so forth. So very different area of study. And it's been fun to see him get interested in and excited about my areas of study. And so a lot of times we'll talk about things, especially now that he's entering into his retirement years, around like, well, how do you think self-determination theory would address this big societal problem? And I'm like, well, I'm glad we're tackling the light issues now. This is great. So
Happy Thanksgiving.
yeah, there we go. Like we mix it all up. And then I, jokingly name rocks things like Fred on vacation, even if there's probably a really good sciencey name for Fred that I can no longer recall from my 8th grade science class.
Good sciencey names. So, but it was still, I mean, it sounds like Dad, there was certainly the applied version. There's a version of geology and things that was like, I'm going to sit in a lab and I'm only going to do academics. There was a more applied version of that was being modeled to you.
Yep.
And did you think, hey, I'm going to grow up and follow that same sort of like, I'll go get a grad degree and then I'll go do applied sort of something?
I I love the idea of it being like this neat little trajectory of like, I thought I would do this. And so I did this, and here I am today. But I really describe the way I've thought about it as a little bit sort of like hop, skip, and jump. Like many people, my initial interest in psychology really centered around like the idea of psychology as a helping profession. As I got,
And is that all the way back as young as 7? Like, are you a 7-year-old being like, hey, I might want to be a therapist. Like, I want to talk to people and help them.
fifth grade
Okay. So
was,
pretty early on. I mean, it's not,
yeah,
but it's
not 7, but yes, very early on was like, that was when that was sort of like percolating, was sort of that notion. And then as I got older, getting through middle school and high school and thinking about like actually pursuing a major in college and what might that turn into in terms of a career. That side of psychology honestly felt really intense and a little overwhelming. And so I was like, well, let me just major in this and see kind of like what happens. And one of the things that happened as part of my undergrad is I, did the typical liberal arts thing. And then of course took a bunch of psychology classes. I double majored in psych and sociology. And so there's a little bit of overlap there. And when I got to sort of like my junior year of undergrad, I was like, I still don't really know what I want to do with this. I know I'm going to have to go to grad school. And I started looking back at like, for the big projects I did for like my higher level classes, like, is there a theme here? And it turned out that all of them just happened to land quite squarely in social psychology, in something around social cognition or motivation, or something along those lines, stereotype formation, all of those kinds of things. And so that was kind of how I went into grad school, was again from sort of that serendipitous place of like, oh well, this happens to be where I'm just gravitating toward. So that was kind of that part.
And talk to me about psychology. I mean, that's like 5th grade is an early time to have even a notion of clinical psych as a, did you know a therapist? You saw it on TV? Like, where did that, I mean, presumably you were not in a school where you had a psychology class in 5th grade, although that would be amazing.
Or dangerous, who knows? Yeah. I think it was actually, and this is going to date me a little bit. I think it was probably actually, I saw like an after school special where there was like a kid who was having a hard time and they were working with a therapist, sort of like really lit me up in terms of like, oh, this is a thing that people can actually do. And this, like, that felt really meaningful to me, to think about sort of like where there's opportunity to have impact.
Well, and those stories are really, I mean, much maligned as they may be, like after school specials were really, they were an
incredibly
introduction.
Impactful. Yeah.
Yeah, they're an introduction into a particular kind of storyline that maybe depending on where you were, you didn't necessarily have access to.
Exactly.
And so was there psychology in high school, or you just had the idea that maybe that was something you want to study, but did you get to do like AP Psych or something?
Yeah, I did take a psych class in high school. I honestly have very little memory of it. I had the great fortune of having a lot of really wonderful teachers in public high school, and psychology happened not to be one of them. but that wasn't a deterrent for me. Like I had other really great classes. I remained very interested in sort of the subject matter and just like understanding why do people do what they do, and what are the things that influence them, both sort of internally in terms of how they're thinking about and responding to things, but also like what's happening around people that has an influence on them. So yeah.
And hence the sociology and psychology double major. So you kind of knew going in, I'm interested in this intersection between humans and the world. I don't quite know what that looks like academically, but I know that this is the interest and the interface that I'm in. Did you mentioned, getting junior year and going, oh man, I don't really know what I want to do here. And then looking back, did you have the help of professors who were kind of saying like, hey, social, the stuff that you're liking is social psych oriented? How did you sort of figure out that social psych, that these things meant social psych?
Yeah. So I went to a very, very small liberal arts college for undergrad. Like it was smaller than my very large Texas public high school by I think a factor of 2 or 3. So very small. And so I had kind of a core set of like 2 or 3 professors in psychology that I was taking classes from and so forth. And one of my major professors happened to be a social psychologist. And so I'm sure that probably had some, not particularly conscious influence on like how I was thinking about these things, certainly. But he was a really my first kind of academic mentor, and a person who just, again, this is a really small school, like not, this was by no means super competitive place to be, but he was like, oh, there's this small liberal arts college in Michigan that's hosting a research conference. You just did this project, like, why don't you submit an abstract? And like, he helped me through that process. And I did my first, conference presentation there. And so that was certainly a person who I think of having, a lot of really positive influence on me pretty early on in my career, and just how I thought about the field of psychology, and also just introducing me in sort of like these, like a really nice gentle on-ramp into things that can be really scary, like presenting at a conference, and just having somebody to kind of help get through some of the, just the practical stuff of how to do that was just incredibly helpful.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, well, and you also, I mean, you had a dad that was in grad school. You had these models. As a first gen college kid, I definitely had no idea what was going, I'm like,
Totally.
there are conferences? You build posters for conferences? Like, what is this? I don't know what any of this stuff is. And so having a Sherpa does, we've now done enough of these that even if it's an N of 1, there are some themes. And certainly one of the themes that emerges is, having a strong mentor, whether that's a professor or somebody in the field or a grad student or another student or somebody, but having somebody sort of say like, oh, there's a thing you could do over there, and you are welcome to do it, and you're invited into it, does seem to have been, a formative experience for a lot of people.
Absolutely.
And then, I mean, you kind of knew, hey, this is going to be something I'm going to have to go off to PhD and kind of get into. How did you do that selection process? You'd narrowed it down. You think it's social psych. How are you choosing programs? How are you choosing professors? I mean, even if you look at social psych, there's 200, 300, programs in the United States. There's a lot to choose from. How did you sort of go about figuring that out?
Very badly. Like honestly, I was not as prepared for that process as I thought I would be. And I really shot for the moon. And I'm a big proponent of doing that. And also like have some backups in mind, sort of just in case. But like, I just went for the moon exclusively, and I got in nowhere the first time around. And this was, again, way back in the day when you would receive this information via mail, like physical mail. And there was a day that I opened up my campus mailbox, and there were 3 rejection letters on a single day. And it was one of the most devastating days of my life, maybe even up to now. Like it was so demoralizing. It was so sad. This mentor of mine was like the first person I told, and he was like incredibly sympathetic and supportive. And he was like, I think you do not need to be in this class today. Why don't you take a beat and like recover?
You might take a walk.
You might. Yeah. And so I ended up having an unplanned for gap year between undergrad and graduate school. And it was really challenging because despite the fact that I had a dad who had gone to grad school and I had had the support of this wonderful mentor as an undergrad, like I went to a small undergrad, like there weren't, grad students or more senior professors that I could work with as an undergrad. And so I didn't have like a lot of the research cred that was sort of a given for most of the graduate programs that I was applying to. And so, yeah, that gap year was a little bit of a struggle of trying to figure out like, what can I do? How can I be more strategic with, and I'm not on my own for the first time. Applying to grad school is expensive. Taking the GRE is terrible. Um, one of the best things about getting into grad school is you don't have to take the GRE ever again, which was like fantastic. But yeah, like, so the second time around, I was like, okay, so like we're gonna have like two shoot for the moon schools, and then we're gonna have like two middle of the road schools, and two like please can I please get in anywhere schools.
And
Like
were
it was.
you, and were you, when, were you applying, you talk about shooting for the moon, were you applying to professors, or were you applying to programs, or were you applying to schools, right? There's like very different lenses for grad schools. And really, in reality, you're applying for professors, right? Like they have an
Right.
open slot and you're applying for a person. But you may or may not know that, right? Certainly I didn't know that. And so if you just naively did this, you're like, okay, I want to go to Stanford, Harvard, like you would just name schools that were big. When you were you stretching in that you were trying to go for professors that were very in demand? Were you going for schools that were really in demand? Were you just going for top social psychology programs? Like how did you pick these?
um I think I've maybe blocked a lot of this. It was such a terrible
Threw in a
experience.
dartboard.
um, well, and so much of this, like this was pre-internet, so like this was a lot of like going to US News and World Report's ranking of psychology graduate programs, like a literal physical thing that you're looking through. And so it was sort of a mix of like, oh, these are names of people who are doing research that I'm interested in. Like I've seen them in like my social psych textbook, or like when I was doing research and like I saw their articles or whatever. So it's sort of like a mix of that and programs. But again, like you were saying, like I was totally naive to this notion that it's like every professor isn't necessarily taking students in a given year. Like that thought never occurred to me. I was like, schools take students every year, so people should be taking students every year. And I ended up um, getting accepted to one school, and was accepted to work with a very junior faculty member who was literally in like his second year, because the faculty member I had applied to work with had retired, and they just like had not updated like the school's listings of like who was there. um yeah, so another moment of serendipity, right? It's sort of like, and we stumble along and here we are.
Yeah. I mean, and that's life. It never really goes as,
Totally.
I turned down Cornell and Stanford to go to Colorado, and then Leaf Van Boven moved to Cornell. So I ended up at Cornell
Anyway.
anyway. And then he said, I'm going back to Colorado. And I said, cool, I'm leaving academia. So, I mean, it doesn't
As
always,
it goes.
but you got into, I mean, Houston is a great school, and back in Texas, right? So there's some ancestral, you're at least back in the Texas ecosystem. Talk to me about going off to grad school. Did you think that, I mean, we started on this journey where you'd seen your dad do applied work. Did you still think, hey, and then I'm going to go get my PhD and then I'm going to do applied work? Or at this time, are you going, I'm going to be a professor and this is going to be the thing?
Yeah. So at that point, um, the options for psychology then, as I understood them to be, were you go the clinical/counseling path,
Right.
and you do therapy things, or you go the academic path. And I was like, the clinical counseling thing, I'm not sure. Like, I'm a bit of an empath. That's a lot. I'm not sure if that's the right fit for me. So I'm going to go academic. And like social psychology, particularly in the early aughts, was like, that's it. Like, that's the path. If you're going to be a social psychologist, that's what you're going to do.
Yep. Yeah, there was historically situated, right? It's always the nature of humans that we acclimate very fast, so it's hard for us to remember a time before, right? But there was no such thing as behavioral science. There was no such thing as behavioral economics. There was no, like it was not, none of these were things that people did at the time in any kind of maybe there were one or two people nibbling around the edges, but you wouldn't have heard of them. right? We
Well,
did.
or they were ashamed. Like in academia, it was like, oh, that's a person who couldn't make it as an academic. Like,
Yes.
yeah.
Yep. There's definitely it's like the weird reverse academia of like, the rest of society has it, if you can't do, teach. And academia is like, if you can't teach, do. And you're like, wait, what? That, that's not how the other people are seeing it. So you're in grad school. There's this tremendous, you got to publish or perish, and you got to go off and do this academic. So you thought, hey, I'm going to go be a professor of social psychology, and I'm going to study stereotype threat or whatever I'm going to study, and then that's my career. Did you think that all the way up to graduation?
Yeah, I thought that up through finishing my PhD and through probably the first 6 years of my career. Like I started on a very academic track. So my most of my graduate school research was actually on close relationships and how people navigate conflict in close relationships. And a lot of the theories that we were using to understand sort of like perseverance and how people approach these things, I started sort of getting in my head this idea of like, well, there are other challenges that people face in their lives in addition to relationship challenges. And that was sort of like what led me down the path of thinking about like how people approach health behaviors and health challenges and those sorts of things. And so I started sort of like dabbling in that space toward the end of grad school, which led me to postdoc. And so I postdoced doing some really interesting research sort of at the intersection of those two spaces. So I did some stuff on like parenting styles around feeding and how that impacts children's development of self-regulation around eating and those sorts of things. But yeah, I was doing the, write the grants and get the publications and fund yourself with the grants. And it's a terrible time to try to do that now. It was also a terrible time to try to do that then. But yeah, I very much sort of started on that track of, postdoc, non-tenure track faculty, like those kinds of things.
And were you still all in, or you had an inkling that maybe this wasn't going to be it?
So there were a couple of sort of turning point moments for me in my academic trajectory. So the first was that pretty early on, it became incredibly clear to me that so much really great research gets done and then it dies at the end of a grant cycle. And it never goes anywhere. Like it just, that's the end. Like the grant funding has run out, you write your papers, the end. And as I understood it, one of the primary reasons why that was happening is because it was just impossible to do these really rigorous interventions at scale. And so I started thinking to myself, well, how can we start to take these principles that we know work and like alleviate some of the human delivery burden that we know this requires? And so here I am back in the year of our Lord 2004, thinking, how might we use technology to help us with this? And in my very first grant application as a principal investigator, I literally had a reviewer say, we are not sure if people will be using their computers for this. Because again, this is 2004, this is pre-iPhone, this is like Palm Pilots, we're proto-BlackBerry days. Like we are not like walking around with these devices in our hands and in our pockets all the time. And so I think it was a reasonable skepticism to have, but I was thinking, surely this technology can do a thing that humans can't always be able to deliver. So that was like sort of one turning point. And then the second turning point, and this was in the years that I was at Rochester and was very frustrated with the grant process. And I was like, there's really only so much I can do as an individual investigator. Like, even if I am incredibly fortunate, incredibly prolific, and get to work with wonderful people, which I was getting to do while I was at Rochester, I'm just one person. Yeah. This is going to end, even with technology, still going to end at the end of a grant cycle with me writing, this has important implications for blah, blah, blah. Somebody should do something about this. And I wanted to be the person who did something about this. So those were sort of like my two aha moments in that transition from thinking about a life as an academic and then moving into something a little more applied.
Yeah, there is definitely a difference between I want to read this paper and do something about it than I want to be the one who wrote this paper. Uh,
Totally.
and I can absolutely hear the sort of like, oh man, this just isn't going to scale. And so that's how did you make the? I mean, but now there's gravity. I mean, you're in the black hole. You're in the well, right? Like you're published thing. There's grants. You're like six. You know, we're in Vietnam. We're 6 years in. Like, how did you? What helped you sort of step away?
Another moment of serendipity, which was one of um, one of the programs I had been working with as a grantee happened to have a position that became available at the National Cancer Institute. And I was like, there are very few things right now that would make me leave academia. There are fewer things in the federal government that I would really be interested in doing, but I know these people and I know this organization, and I know that they, in addition to doing, you know, some of the mid-level bureaucrat work that we're hired to do, they are also very actively engaged in shaping research, in participating in research, in doing things at a much larger scale than what I can do as a single individual working in a university setting. And so that was step one in the stepping away from academia.
And so I hear less about strong promoting pressures there. You know, I really knew this is, but you know, there's some weaker inhibiting pressures. Saying I know these people, it's an easy pathway. Like there's an opportunity here. It feels, I don't want to say low risk, but lower risk, right?
Totally.
Than maybe some other options. And, you know, and also on an important thing, right? Like, you know, cancer and smoking are obviously huge societal issues. So there's some temptation, some promoting pressure there around like, hey man, this is just something that like is a really big, important thing to go work on. But you haven't ended up right. There's an alternative universe where you step out of academia, but you end up in sort of NGO, nonprofit land, and you go do, or even government, right? In some, you know, you go NIH or whatever, and you're off on this sort of public health version of the track. And you were there then again for a while because, right, like, you know, you're. It's not like you were at NCI for a second, right? Like you had a career there. What was it like to step away from academia into that more applied place? Did you find it comfortable, uncomfortable? Like what rubbed, what felt very smooth?
Yeah. So I one of the best pieces of advice when I first started at NIH was somebody told me like it will take you a solid 2 years to really know how to do this job. And it was some of the best advice I've ever received because up until that point, like the transition from grad student to postdoc and then postdoc to like faculty position, like that's a pretty like natural progression. This was a very different beast because this was learning about like the inner workings of like how funding announcements are created, the, you know, what happens at study section, how do you talk to grantees, like what's the right level of information, like how do you help them like work through the process, and then oh also there are these side quests you can go on provided you're still doing this other work here. And so, yeah, to your point, it totally felt like relatively lower risk, especially because I knew that I could continue earning academic currency if I changed my mind. Like I could continue publishing there. I was going to be at conferences. I was actually able to assemble groups of experts and colleagues to like really wrestle with what I was hoping would be like new areas of funding or things that we could be doing differently. And so it was a good transition path for me. And it was another one of those moments where it was the right time in history, I guess, to be there, in that the NCI had uniquely created this thing that at the time was a set of websites called smokefree.gov. It was the first time the Department of Health and Human Services had done anything like this, which was how do we take the evidence base that we know on smoking cessation and disseminate it to the masses? And so I actually got to work with one of the folks who created that initial platform and then start to expand it into other things. And this is again at a time where we're thinking in terms of like web content, text messaging programs, like those were kind of like the primary mechanisms of using technology for health behavior interventions. But it was so much fun to get to do that. And then there were also like some larger organizational interests in like, how do we start to get the academic world to work cross-functionally effectively? Because like the way it is in academia is like, I have to know all the things rather than like, I know all the things about behavior and motivation, and now I need to partner with the person who knows all the things about how to build an app, or the person who knows all the things about how to design an experience. And so like we were trying to facilitate some of those collaborations that can happen within a university if you just know who to reach out to or even what department to go to. And so that was a ton of fun. And I really wanted that to be my full-time job, which it could not be at NIH. And so that was what brought me to the next transition.
But so some of that wayfinding, that cross-functional stuff, did you have an independent interest in tech, or it was sort of, hey, I have this health interest and it's bringing me to tech, and it's bringing me to the web, and it's bringing me to this next stop on the.
I pretty early on saw tech as the tool that could be used to start to scale stuff. And it was just a matter of figuring out, how do we take this stuff that we have evidence works well in sort of like this one-on-one sort of way, and translate those principles into a text message that a person might see, or down the road like an app experience, those sorts of things. But I was pretty, 2004 was thinking about technology as sort of like the way that we get this out into the world.
And so you go through your NCI experience, like you're on this sort of path, you're down this public health thing, and then there is a turn, right, as you move over more into the tech side and the wellness side and the health side, rather than yet another bend here that might be NGO, government, nonprofit, whatever, right? Like you could be the head of NCI now. We're not on down that track. What made you go, hey, I want to try maybe putting my foot more firmly in the digital side of this?
Yeah, I think it was mostly how much fun I was having working on the smokefree.gov stuff, and really like it was just resonating with me, like the challenge of trying to do that translation from how we deliver an intervention in person, and what are the real principles here of behavior change and of motivation, and like how do we translate that into like these nuggets that people are going to be able to use. And they're like, I was just so excited about that. And so it was really that excitement. And also, it was very early in the days of companies trying to think about, how do we do this? Because they were also starting to feel the crunch of, we know that this helps our employees, we know that this is good for our patients, but we don't have the human capacity to do the one-on-one stuff. So it was really just sort of like that excitement of doing that kind of work that led me to that next pivot.
And did you start to sort of have an eye out into were you job searching? Like, what were you even looking for? Right. Because at this point you kind of, you're in the sort of health scientist, program director, kind of program manager kind of world, which doesn't 100% translate over into tech, like in a perfect one-to-one way. How are you, were you calling yourself a behavioral scientist yet? Like, what were you looking for? Because, this is still, 2015 or 2016 or whatever, where it wasn't like we were lousy with behavioral scientists. The term was starting to be used. There were a few people out there, right? Like, but it wasn't, it was 20, not 200, and not 2000.
Right. This was another moment of fumbling for sure. I kind of took a bit of a leap with this. And I don't even remember what the search terms were that I would have used, but I just started looking at job descriptions And this is advice. I talk to lots of folks who are coming out of PhD programs or thinking about career transitions. And this is one of the things that I tell people all the time. Do not look for a job title because they're all over the map. Read the job description. Does it sound like something you want to do? If it sounds like something you want to do, that's your job. Like, it doesn't matter what it's called.
Right.
The title of the job that I applied for was Program Innovation Manager. I have no idea what that collection of words means, but I read the job description and I was like, this sounds interesting. This sounds like the kind of thing that I want to do. It was an employee wellness company. They were doing some interesting things with behavior change. I was like, I don't know if I'm the right fit for this. Let me send them my 30-page Vita and see how they like this. And which I also tell people, don't do what I did. This was not the way to handle this. But thankfully, again, this was like this moment of really great fortune. The hiring manager waded through that crazy 30-page academic Vita and said, this is the kind of person that we need that we didn't know we needed. And I interviewed and we played around with different job titles so that it felt right. And I made the leap.
And did you feel that pull when you go for an interview? Did you know, oh yeah, this is, these are my people, this is what I want to do kind of from the beginning?
I did. This was a really special place to work. The woman who created the company had really done a fantastic job of creating a really great culture. And the person who ended up being my boss is the person that I describe to this day as like the best boss I've ever had. Like, she really taught me like what it means to be an effective manager, what it means to not just manage a project, but to really help people that you are supervising. She was a fantastic advocate for her direct reports. And I think that's a really special skill set. And she was also like a real no bullshit person. Like, she was whip smart and really good at what she did. And she had a really good gut instinct of things. And I worked for that company for, I think, 2.5 years. And I am still in touch with several people that I worked with there. Like, when I go back to DC, like, I see those folks. And that, I think that it was kind of the combination of like the work and the culture that were just real selling points for me, and really like, oh, this would be a good place to land.
So in some ways it sounds like it was a very soft landing, kind of by happenstance, but a lot of it driven by people. These are people who respect what you do, you respect what they, you're ticking a lot of the psychological safety boxes, right? It's okay to make mistakes. These are people I know. They value what I do. I value what they do. And so that felt like a sort of a soft landing out of academia.
It was in so many ways. And also like, oh man, was there a steep learning curve there?
Yes. Well, you mentioned part of it, right? I think one of the things you called out there that I think is really important is like, there's a whole like hiring and firing and corporate hierarchy, like, the things that you need to do to make a company function are not anything like the things that we do to make government or government and universities are a mob of people sort of squabbling into the same direction, hopefully, right? It's not the sort of like, let's build a battleship out of Legos
Right.
version of like, there's a thing we're doing here and we're doing it in their jobs and their roles and descriptions and we do the thing. Right. What else did what other things? So there's one part of the sort of like structure and business and hiring and firing and sort of the corporateness of it. What else felt like a big learning for you?
I think the biggest learning curve was really around science communication. Like, up until that point in my career, I had largely been surrounded by nerds like me, who used vocabulary and jargon like me. And that turns out not to be a particularly effective way of communicating about evidence that might inform the development of a product. And so like there were a ton of fits and starts with that. And again, I was really fortunate to get to work with people who were incredibly gracious with my clumsiness around that. But I learned a ton about working with engineers who are like, I need to know how to build the thing. And they're equally, and I think this is a thing that people often get wrong about engineers, especially coming from like behavioral science or public health. Many engineers are very task focused. Most of the engineers I've interacted with over these last 12 years of my career are just as interested in knowing why are we doing it this way. Yeah. And so I had a really great opportunity to sort of like cut my teeth on the science communication with an engineer who like thinks in a very different way than I do, but could like really latch on to like, oh, so people aren't going to do it if we do it this way. I'm like, probably not. I'm like, oh, okay, got it. That makes sense. Why is that? And they're like, can I read a book about that? And so like there was just a lot of really lovely like curiosity in that. And also, you know, I think there's such a really nice synergy between design and behavioral science. And so getting to work with design partners, and again, coming back to sort of that thing I mentioned earlier about like not needing to know all the things, like that's the greatest thing for me about working with engineers and designers is like they're good at all the things that I'm terrible at, and like and they're just as interested in like what I have to bring to the table. And so it's just a lot of fun to do that.
And we are very fortunate in that, you know, everyone is an armchair psychologist, right? Everyone is fascinated by the human condition. It's part of being human, right? And so we're not your dad trying to explain geology to somebody who's like, rocks boring, right? It's like, humans and the way they are and the reason they are the way they are, which everyone goes like, oh yeah, humans.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I see that as a little bit of a double-edged sword. Like on the one side, like you're absolutely right. Like there's this natural curiosity to it. And also, and this has also been a lesson I've learned sort of repeatedly is people are just as likely to be like, oh, I behave, therefore I understand behavior. Right. And it's like, well, you may understand your own behavior, but understanding sort of like most of the people most of the time, and like, and these are also fantastic conversations to have, and I especially enjoy having these conversations with engineers because the way many of the engineers I've worked with approach their own life and their own behaviors is just vastly different than what I would ever recommend we put into a product. But they're like, here's my instinct. What if we made a leaderboard for everything? I'm like, how about we don't? Like, great tool for certain use cases, maybe not for this one over here, you know. And yeah, so blessing and curse to have that interest.
I think for me and probably for everybody who ends up in behavioral science, I'd rather have to talk someone out of their naive theory, but at least they were curious and interested, than have to try and sell them you should be really interested in rocks.
Absolutely.
Right? But you're right. I mean, there are lots of bad naive theories that happen. You know, the rise and fall of gamification in Silicon Valley is a lovely example of like, you know, when you take a bunch of Stanford grads who have a very particular, you know, on the spectrum mindset of how these things work, and you're like, look, man, like, I don't know about you, but like, that's not everybody. Not everybody wants everything to be a leader. I hate leaderboards. Like
streaks. Also not a fan of streaks.
I personally, I think what's motivating for me about streaks is the social element of streaks. So like sharing a streak with my son in Duolingo is an interesting mechanic and is a lovely way to teach. You know, I left home at 15 and so, and moved to Hong Kong while my parents were still in the US. And so like, I've always had distance with the ones that I love. So I'm very interested in those social experiences that allow me to like, have just little like light touches with them that are like, hey, I'm still here, you're still here, the lights are still on, right? My son, you know, because I have a co-parent, he's with me half the time, he's at her house half the time, and you know, we have an awesome relationship, but I don't see him every day, and right. So it's just like a little like, well, I at least know he was alive enough to learn Spanish today.
10 minutes of Spanish today.
10 minutes of Spanish, so like I know that he was that alive. That little ping, I get the like. My streak, my leaderboard, my thing, my points, my experience, my levels, like all of those, I'm like, I don't know, I'm just trying to learn Spanish here, man. Like, but it works for some people, you know, and that's the great diversity of is there, do you have, regret is not the right word. Are there parts of you that would like to interrogate the alternative universe where you had stayed in academia or had stayed on the sort of NGO nonprofit government side?
Um, yeah, I mean, I feel like at different points in my life and different points in my career, I've had those little like, it's a wonderful life kind of moments, you know. What if George, whose last name is escaping me, hadn't been born? Yeah. It's I don't have any regrets about not staying in academia. I believe that academic research is incredibly important, and I enjoy very much keeping up with the evidence base. And that was just not the right career path for me. And so you know, when I was looking to leave NCI, I did contemplate going back to academia, and ultimately decided like I just don't think that's what I want to do. You know, this is my one wild and precious life. I don't think this is how I want to spend this part of it.
What informed that decision? How did you know?
Um, I didn't miss it.
Hmm.
I really didn't. I've I have a lot of great friends who are academics that I'm still in touch with, that I see, whose company I enjoy. I love hearing what they're doing and what they're working on. Um, I don't miss publishing. I don't miss trying to get research funding. I really and truly love taking those findings and figuring out how do they scale? How do they land in a piece of technology that could change lots of lives? And I not in like a grandiose, you know, legacy building kind of way, but more like this is where I want to have impact. This is what resonates for me. And so, yeah, that's I don't have any regrets about that. NGO government stuff. I mean, you know, who knows? I probably have 10 to 15 years left in my career. Who knows what will happen over that time period and what that will look like. I never say never. I think there are always and I think my career trajectory is like the big story of that. Like it really was like these moments of stumbling that happened to turn out great. And so you know, I think that's another thing that I like to tell people is, first of all, one of the things I love the most about being in the private sector is I am not thinking about taking a job that I'm going to be in for the rest of my life. Whereas with academia, you often are, because like you get the job and it's tenure track and you work really hard, and then hopefully you get tenure after working really hard. That doesn't always happen, but hopefully you do. And like that's where you stay. And so for me, like career pivots and career changes are often like what feels right for me right now, whether that is at this stage in my life with the things that are going on outside of work, with where I want my career to be in the next however many years. And I like having that flexibility and the notion of, you know, being someplace for a few years is enough.
Yes, although you've been at your current employer for a while.
It's the longest I've been anywhere. Like NCI was the longest before then at 5 years. So yeah, I've tended to change jobs. So
Yeah, I mean, I think in a healthy way. I also think, you know, if you're a social psychologist, you know, some of the magic's in the end. You know, I loved, people were very surprised when I went to Microsoft after several successful startup exits. They were like, why would you go do that? But it's like, you know, I think the first thing I ever launched had like 7 million users on the first day. Or, you know, you're just like, as a startup, it's really tough to beat those kinds of numbers, right? If what you know, if you're in the end game, social psychology is a group game, right? Like, you know, it's hard to get that many at bats elsewhere.
totally. And like again, like, and I don't know how you thought about this, but like there's a time in your life where you can do the hustle that's required of a startup. And there's a time in your life where that just does not fit. And so being at a more established company can be like a place that you get to do great work. You get to be surrounded by a lot of really smart people who are smart in completely different ways than you are. And you don't have to worry about raising the next round, which is also nice.
And but you know, you, as you said, you have some chapters left in your book. Do you think you end up somewhere smaller at some point? Would you ever want to start something? Like what kind of, I mean, do you ever think about those experiences? We talked a little bit about the paths you've been on. As we talk about the paths you might be on, is there a part of you that wants to found something? Is there a problem that niggles at your brain?
I mean, there's so many interesting problems to solve, right? And I think there are a lot of interesting things happening right now. I think now is like we're in a very fascinating time in terms of how we think about health and wellness. I think we're in a really fascinating time with technology and what's happening. I think we're also in a really interesting time at the intersection of technology and policy, frankly. Like it's a little bit, much like it was 10, 15 years ago, like we're in a little bit of a Wild West sort of situation. There are things that users are doing with technology that they're going to do regardless of what gets built. And so, how do we think about that stuff strategically from sort of like a safety perspective? Data privacy, I think, is a huge issue in all of this. So, would I ever start my own thing? I don't know. That makes me feel excited and nervous. So a little bit, I guess, nervous-sided, skited, however you want to portmanteau those two words. But I think that requires a level of focus that I'm not sure that I have at this point. But again, never say never. Women's health, a lot of really fascinating things happening right now, particularly thinking about women's health over a lifetime and not just during years when they might be, having humans and those kinds of things. And I think for a very long time, women's health, men's bodies and men's biology were thought of as default. And so it's really exciting to see medical care thinking more about women. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff happening right now with trans health. And certainly on the policy side, there's a lot going on there as well. So I don't know. Who knows? I don't have a crystal ball. Would love one. If you have one, please share.
Well, and to your point, it is the Wild West, but it won't continue that way forever, right? Inevitably, we'll need some sensible guideline here for the betterment of all, and maybe in a different administration, maybe in a different moment, that sort of comes about in ways that I think probably will stabilize the environment a little bit, right? Civilization tends to be good for building these kinds of things, right? When not everybody's walking around with a pistol shooting at whoever they want, things do tend to get overall better for everybody.
Sure. And like there was panic about the radio. So like, of course, there's going to be some panic about whatever is here now and whatever will be here in 5 years or 10 years or what have you.
Yeah. I think it's a fascinating time to be doing what we're doing for sure.
It really is.
For sure. Both big and small, right? And there are some traditional tech companies that are barely tech companies anymore, right? That and there are very few companies that aren't at least somewhat a tech company along the line, which to your point, over the course of the last 20 years as a behavioral science, right? If we just take 2006 to 2026 as a 20-year span, there was a big difference between a tech company and a non-tech company back in the day.
For sure.
I don't know that, I think Walmart's pretty much a tech company and Microsoft is in lots of things that aren't tech. So it's an interesting place for sure. When you think about situating yourself in the future, how do you think about when enough is enough? You talked a little bit about having moved around and, having spent, is it the itchy feet feeling that tends to make you be the thing? Like, how do you know when it's time?
I tend to I tend to find that either the stars align on something that is related to a project I'm working on, or the stars align related to the humans I'm working with. By which I mean to say, like, a project makes a major change in direction that is maybe absolutely the right change in direction for the project, but maybe not the best alignment with where I will bring the most value. And similarly, we talked about this a little bit earlier, like who you're working with is so critical. And I feel incredibly fortunate throughout my career, to have had a lot of wonderful people that I've gotten to work with. And like, at some point, wonderful people will find wonderful new opportunities. And as those wonderful people find those wonderful new opportunities, and or a project changes direction, or both, I think those are often sort of like signs to me. It's always been obvious to me in sort of an intuitive way that like, oh, and now it's time. It's like, oh, this company has decided that behavior is hard. Well, yes, you are correct. That is how we've had careers. And if it is too hard of a nut to approach right now, and now is not the right time or whatever, then like, okay, that's a valuable piece of information for me to have. Or like, we think there's a thing that the technology can do that requires very little of the human to do. Great. I think you're probably right in this case. Also, maybe not where I need to be. Also fine, or the person that you work with most closely has just gone on to their next great thing, and you're feeling sort of like the whole of like that loss of collaboration and sort of like the synergy that you got to have, like bouncing ideas off and the different perspectives and so forth. And it's like, I kind of miss that. I need to look for where I'm going to find that again.
Yeah, that whole idea that change begets change, right? You're monitoring signals in the environment that are telling you it's time. And you said something earlier that I think that you just touched on again, which is the notion of missing something, right? I didn't miss academia, so it doesn't tell me that I should go back there. And that maybe at times you experience these misses, and that feeling of longing can be a very powerful one.
For sure. And I think, over the last few months, and I haven't named names very much in this conversation, but earlier this year, Ed DC, one of the co-founders of self-determination theory, died. And I worked very closely with Ed and Rich and other folks in the SDT community. And those are the kinds of moments that also sort of capture your attention and make you think like, oh, I spent this really formative time in my life and in my career working with these folks, really shaping how I think about humans and what makes humans flourish. And like, those are the kinds of opportunities that I sort of like want to make sure that I'm really well grounded in. Like, behavioral science, for me, behavioral science can be used to build really lots of different things. But for me, what's really important is this a thing that's going to somehow make people's lives better and not just give them another thing? And so that has created some really lovely opportunities for reflection.